Welcome to the HealthTech Edge, the podcast that covers how technology is reshaping healthcare operations. I'm Mike Moore. Each episode is a practical conversation with leaders who are building, buying, or running the tools that reduce administrative burden and improve productivity in healthcare. Today's episode is about how healthcare leaders can make better decisions about the companies they choose to work with. Healthcare executives are surrounded by digital health vendors, smart ideas, strong missions, bold claims about efficiency, AI, and outcomes. But many of these companies never deliver real value at scale. Some get stuck in pilots, others disappear altogether. My guest today is Sally Ann Frank. She leads health and life sciences at Microsoft for Startups and is the author of two books, The Startup Protocol, which looks at why many digital health startups fail, and The Unicorn Protocol, which studies the companies that actually scaled. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mike. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. And I think what's really fascinating, and having written a book myself years ago, is that it's a lot of work to put that experience together, but it really does take, it gives you an opportunity in your career to really reflect, right? And kind of look deeply and think about the issues. And I love that, that you've put that effort in. So we're going to dive into the two books, but let's go ahead and start with what your role is focused on today at Microsoft and what your focus is.
Sure. So, Microsoft for Startups has been around for decades, and its charter is to help early stage companies grow and scale using our technology. About 5 years ago, we launched an industry perspective where we have four, soon to be five industries that we are focused on because they're high priority. And within those, we cultivate a set of high potential startups that we work with much more closely. So Microsoft for Startups is largely a scale program where we've got tens of thousands of startups using our technology. In the Pegasus portfolio, we're focused on go-to-market technical excellence. And then as we turn our attention to the other startups in our program, we're also looking at how do we scale go-to-market and how do we really provide a holistic experience for these early stage companies within our ecosystem so that we can help them. And of course, part of my job is to essentially take our high potential startups and connect them with our customers, understanding the voice of the customer and then bringing in startups that can help accelerate that innovation, whether it's a build versus buy decision or it's an opportunity to fill a gap that they've just not been able to fill on their own because they're just too busy keeping the lights on and keeping operations in practice.
That's great. And I'm sure that that's an early validation for a lot of the ideas. There's always the premise of, they have an idea for the company. They've tried to validate it in the market. They're trying to get early customer input and obviously get a sense of product market fit, those kind of things. So the guidance and the experience of the team at Microsoft, I know from having spent some of my career at Microsoft as well, is an important piece of bringing some technology, but also some business and customer expertise to those startups as they get rolling.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the things that I think is really important, specifically in health and life sciences, is that there is a group of startups that are a product market fit in the Pegasus portfolio that are ready to buy or get their solutions are ready to be purchased by our enterprise customers. But similarly, sometimes in health and life sciences, organizations really are looking for co-development opportunities. And so how do we bring in perhaps a slightly earlier stage startup that has an MVP, but is looking for that partner to give them clinical validation or to provide input that actually kind of finishes that MVP into something that's more product market fit?
Yeah, which is where some amazing collaboration can take place. So let's get a little into the Startup Protocol, your first book. You talk a lot about founder blind spots. And really, from the buyer's side, if you're a healthcare executive listening to this podcast today, that might often be when you're meeting these startups as they're kind of getting into the market and getting into the space, maybe run into them without realizing some of these blind spots. So do you want to talk more about what the blind spots are and what the impact is on potential first customers as they're entering the market?
So there are a couple of pointers that I could give actually to both sides. So one of the things that immediately tells me we're in trouble is when I ask an early stage founder who else is trying to solve this problem, and they go no one, and I'm like, That's not a thing. Like if you've figured out this is a problem, there's at least 400 other people that are also trying to figure this out. So that's a red flag. And I think if you're an enterprise company and you're a CIO, CMO or whatever, CMIO, and you're talking to an early stage startup and they tell you that, then that's a problem, because that is indicative that the founder may not be coachable, or the founder may have a distinct vision that is unchanged or unchangeable by someone with actual expertise. So that's one particular area. The other thing that I see often that is also translates into an issue for a prospective customer is having part of the overall package overdeveloped. So I always talk about the fact that your product development roadmap, regulatory roadmap, and go-to-market strategy all have to be braided together. They have to be intertwined. And so if you, as an enterprise customer looking at a startup, understands that this startup has spent an enormous amount of time working on the product, which is good, but they don't understand who's going to buy it, what their business model should be, or they don't have their regulatory pathway already mapped out, that's a problem, because they're only going to go so far with just the product. All these other things need to be taken into consideration. And I want to harp especially on the business model, because I've seen a lot of solutions that really would lend value to the ecosystem. And I go, well, who's going to buy it? Is it a reimbursable solution for our payers and providers? Those types of things will stop it dead. And then I'm also looking at adoption. So if you're an enterprise customer and you're looking at a startup and you go, okay, what's the first step? And they go, pilot. Great. Okay, we can do a pilot. What happens next? And I've seen a lot of pilots essentially die because the startup hadn't really considered what happens after the pilot. Like, do we go to another service line and stand up the pilot there? Or do we take the pilot that we've already built and now extend it to more clinicians or more, so there are pathways that have been established that are successful as you go from pilot to full production wins, but oftentimes that's not been mapped out. And so you go to a pilot and it's like, wow, this was really cool. Now what? And the startup goes, I'm not sure, and they rely on their customers to kind of guide them, which is not ideal. Ideally, you want to have a pathway that is both developed by a startup and perhaps pitched to the enterprise customer, and the enterprise customer comes back and goes, okay, I see where you're going. Doesn't quite work for us, but we could do it X, Y, and Z. We could change it a little bit. So it might not be the end-all, be-all pilot to production pathway, but having an understanding of what is needed and pitching that to your customer after or during, ideally, the pilot, so that they know what comes next. Then you can start building on the bespoke version of that pilot to production approach for your customer, because the thing that happens mostly when a pilot is successful and there's no implementation plan, the law of diminishing interest sets in. So you set up your pilot, your pilot works, and you're on, day 90 of that pilot. The longer you go to an implementation process, then people are going to forget about you, and the law of diminishing interest takes hold.
Especially in this world of AI, where a new release of everything comes out weekly, right? And
Yes, right.
competing offerings. I think, the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about pilots is that many times the pilots are constructed in this wonderfully clean environment with limited variables where there's not a lot that is there to kind of challenge or distract. But then the real world implementation now all of a sudden brings in all of these other elements and factors. It could be data that needs to be integrated. It could be other elements, right? But those, it's kind of like, you're going from the laboratory out into the real world, and then sometimes reality can hit you in the face pretty hard. And again, if the startup or the customer isn't prepared for that, it could be shocking.
Right. And oftentimes those pilots are with some kind of clinical champion or sponsor or scientist, whatever. And then once you go into implementation, guess what? You have to talk to IT. And IT's responsibility is largely to keep the lights on and keep things moving. So looking at implementation also has to deal with looking at all the stakeholders involved in that implementation and what the change management plan is going to be.
And how much of that responsibility sits on the vendor's shoulders versus the customers, right? Because there's that partnership, and I think that
Right.
is the kind of the co-innovation or co-development or co-whatever model,
Right.
and how that's shared. It doesn't. I think if you're willing to experiment in this space with startups from a customer point of view, you likely realize they don't have everything figured out. So then it's kind of like, what will they figure out, or how do we kind of complement each other to make this? Because uh, I think some cases, like the potential is so great, it's worth the experimentation. But then in other situations, maybe it's too much risk. What have you seen in that regard?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to remember is that when you're in the pilot phase, you need to be prepping for full implementation. And that means connecting with IT, connecting with procurement, connecting with anybody else who might be involved in the larger procurement process. As far as like de-risking for the enterprise customer, that should be done during the pilot, but also the communication between the startup and the pilot sponsor needs to be very clear and consistent so that as you're going through and getting feedback on how the pilot is going, you're also prepping and making sure that you are identifying and addressing any risks that that sponsor, that champion, may anticipate as you expand out. And so building that plan as part of, implementation, change management, adoption, risk management, all has to be tied together.
So a lot of the work that you do in your role, you are bringing your partners forward, introducing them to customers, helping to make those matches happen. So even before we get to pilot stage, probably a lot of demos that you sit through. When you think about some of the healthcare executives from the customer side that are receiving these presentations and then maybe asking the questions or kind of digging in, what are some of those ones that you can recall where they're like, they get it, they really know what they're doing in terms of evaluating these health tech partners?
So I think having the ROI conversation is really important. And I think understanding how the business model is going to fit within the enterprise organization is also helpful. Obviously, if you're SaaS, it's pretty straightforward, but SaaS brings its own issues because where's the data going to sit? So I think, looking at all of the quadrants, if you will, of the implementation is going to be key. Like you mentioned before, data. You mentioned interoperability. You mentioned consistency of outcome and ROI. Like all of these things have to be addressed early on by both the enterprise customer. They need to know these things and they need to ask the right questions. If they're looking at a company and they say, well, and this is another thing for your enterprise customers, if you're talking to the CEO every time, that startup is not ready for you. And I know that a lot of startups are going to be angry with me. CEOs should be coming in to close the deal, but they should have people on their team who's responsible for building these pathways to the customers. And so when I talk to my enterprise customers, I try and make sure that we are bringing someone that is mature enough to deliver. And that's probably one of the biggest de-risking things that we can do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it is sometimes the benefit. And I talk to a lot of startup CEOs on this podcast who are introducing their wonderful technology solution, but it is a key piece. And this is kind of my day job here, doing partnerships at Productive Edge. Is like you say, it's meeting the team. So who's responsible for delivering this? Because CEOs with their charm and charisma and intellect and all these great skills that they develop, which is helping to run and kind of define a strategy for the company, secure funding for growth, all the great things that a CEO typically is responsible for. ultimately the rubber hits the road, we need to figure out who's responsible for this. And I think that is great coaching to meet the rest of the team and see and hear from them, because they will be the ones that they and their teams, presumably, you're working with on a day-to-day basis. And I think hearing real impact stories from their experience so far as well, because we use the term startup, but the age of these startups, I'm sure, is varies as you kind of work with them too. That some may be in their first year of operation, and others may be a couple years into it, but still considered startup, right? And have varying levels. But yeah, that's a great point. The CEOs, we root for them, but yes, they must be surrounded by others who can actually help deliver.
Right. Yes.
So let's talk about the unicorn protocol. So, startup protocol, we're looking at those companies, why they succeed and fail. Unicorn, now we're talking about those who scale. When we're looking at them and kind of studying their success, what are some of the things that you notice about those companies?
So, just to give folks a view into the Unicorn Protocol, so it's 10 interviews with 10 digital health and life sciences founders, and they're household names: Amwell, Athena Health, Innovaccer, all the ones that you know, and a few that perhaps you don't. But there were a few key things. And I think the first one was the focus on mission, like to exclude everything else. When they got to funding, obviously that took hold. But all of these founders were so mission driven that their approach generally was, if you stick with the mission and you're true to the mission, everything else will follow. And so it wasn't so much about money. It wasn't so much about getting that first customer, as much as it was, if we stick to the mission, we will get that first customer. We'll get that 10th customer. So I think that was kind of first and foremost. The other thing that was quite surprising is that many of them developed really interesting business models, like ones that you never would have imagined would work. One company actually sold futures to the solution that they hadn't yet built. One company sold their documentation for the tool that they were building to other developers, and then when it was time to turn on the lights and say, "Here, the solution is," they had built-in customers. I mean, just some of the innovative ways of thinking about the problem. Element Biosciences, Molly He, like they're doing DNA sequencing, but she saw a niche where no one else. She saw white space where no one else saw white space, and so the innovative minds that these startups, not only the startup founders had, but then surrounded themselves with, was really incredible. And I think that comes out as kind of a theme, like think outside of the box, think in ways that you can bring value in new and different ways that people aren't doing. And, I think those are a couple of the things. I also think the innovative ways of thinking transferred into other areas like hiring. Like Abhinav from the Innovaccer, he said they didn't hire for people that they needed today. They hired for people they thought would be helpful for them in 2 years, which is a really
Wow.
interesting way to look at it. So the book is filled with like these little nuggets of innovative thinking that really turned these startups from, you know, an almost was to really innovative market making. I mean, Athena Health, like Jonathan Bush, like really thought about things in a different way.
Well, I think the focus there and the mission, there are so many problems, especially, I'm sure as you talk with your colleagues in the Microsoft startup program, work across industries. Every industry has problems. We know this. Every industry has opportunities that can be focused on and solved for using technology, especially now with AI disrupting everything. But healthcare as an industry, there are so many problems to solve that I could see how a startup founder or a team at a startup could try and stretch themselves by focusing on so many things versus keeping that focus on a singular problem and really trying to go deep and do it well.
And I think one of the things that comes out in the book, in two cases at least, the founder started building something and then saw an opening or was exposed to an opening that, oh, we should be doing that. And then they pivoted the company. This was both Athena Health and Lunit out of South Korea. They started building something else, and then something, a light bulb went off either through people they were talking with or through their own kind of machinations, like, oh, we should be doing this instead. And then that new mission became the be all end all. So it's not like you wake up one day and you say, I'm going to build this digital health startup or this life sciences startup, and I have to put blinders on. It's more about building and being open to changes. But once you've got that mission locked, then it's got to be locked. And the product development roadmap and the expansion of that initial solution comes later, and you should definitely plan for that. But you've got to be successful in one thing first before you can build out. And actually, the chapter about ADOC, Elad Wallach, is a really good example of that. And so maybe people find affinity in that one.
Yeah, I think that, from the customer's perspective, then we can pivot and look at it from their point of view on this topic, which is when you're talking to these health tech vendors that come in and do the demo and everything, it's really kind of probing around that focus and what is their mission and what are they focused on and how deep are they in that space.
Right.
Because if they don't have that kind of focus, I know part of the conversation with customers is always, especially about startups, will they be around in, we used to say 2 years or 5 years, right? And who knows what the time that people put on that conversation now. But I think that's a lot of probably the customers that you are in front of with your startup partners as well, right? Is they're saying like, what kind of focus and what is your plan? Where are you 2 to 5 years from now? So
Right.
that we can try to, AI is very difficult to predict next week, but as
Yeah.
much as we can, let's try to predict the future a bit and where this is going to go.
Well, and that's the thing. When we first started on this Gen AI journey, one of the things that we noticed is that there were a bunch of startups that were popping up to do like one little thing. Like there was one that was looking at drugs to repurpose them for other uses. Really interesting, but that's going to be overtaken, in a few months by a larger organization. So the way AI is today, there are these little gaps that people can fill with their startup, but it often won't be sustainable because some larger organization, which might just be a larger startup, will expand into that area and overtake them. And so from an enterprise perspective, understanding, okay, how niche is this? And does this have potential to grow? Or do I look at this particular niche and try and solve it with somebody I'm already working with, or a larger organization, a larger startup, a larger enterprise? Because it can get really, really finite on what problem they're trying to solve, which is sometimes helpful. But if it's too narrow, it will be overtaken by somebody else.
Right. It's the classic, I think it's a Shark Tank reaction, right? Like this is a
Yeah.
product, not a company, right?
Right.
It's interesting what you're doing. It's, it fills a need, but is it a company and is that something, that's I'm sure investors, that's quite the orientation for them. But I think from a customer point of view, especially in healthcare, again, with what we see on a daily basis, is that there are so many point solutions
Oh, yes.
that from a customer point of view, it's overwhelming the number of things, just the sheer number of players that might try to get on your calendar and present to you, and how you balance what those are and how might, again, going back to kind of the role that partners and customers play, who's responsible for trying to stitch all of this together? Let's say we did it, whatever it is.
Right.
How do we stitch that together with all this? And then what's the role of the CIO's organization for a health system or for a health payer? Are they playing an integrator? Are they stitching it together? Are they partnering with a company like Productive Edge in the work that we do, where we help put these elements together and kind of build that connective tissue, from a data or AI or governance or all these other kind of layers that need to be involved?
Yeah, I think in healthcare, especially the integration with electronic medical records and revenue cycle management systems and all of these is incredibly important. And it's good that we have companies like you that you like yours that focus on that area. As Microsoft is at its core a foundational platform productivity company, and so oftentimes we try to be that connective tissue as well. I think about the release of Dragon Copilot, our ambient workflow tool that we released in October, and how several of our startups were part of that launch because their solutions are being integrated into that approach. And so the the days of those point solutions are getting very, very numbered. Now, I will say from a startup perspective, I know that enterprise customers, if you're just testing it out, they will go over to this little area and test it out and do something, but that's not sustainable. The customer, once they validate, yes, this is valuable to me, but it'll be even more valuable if you stick it in the EMR and it's a tab in Epic or whatever. So it's a stepping stone, but it's not the end. It has to be integrated into the existing workflows, or it's just not going to be adopted, and there's not going to be the traction and the ROI that everyone is expecting.
Right. I think that's and both of us have been in the industry for a long time. So thinking about kind of the platform plays, the ecosystem plays, if you're in the Microsoft world, right? I spent, time at Microsoft, as I mentioned earlier. And so, to have a customer say, well, we're a Microsoft shop, or we're a whatever shop, right? It gives an indication, but it's from a health tech vendor, the startups coming in, they need to have a perspective about which ecosystems they play in. So if you're going to deploy, I'm sure that all your partners, of course, participating in your program, 100% Azure, right? So they're coming in, we play on Azure, and it's like, okay, well, do you actually leverage any of the components of Azure, or are you just sitting on it, kind of hosted on it, and in theory could be placed on any other cloud, right? So it's
Right.
like we want to see what are the other, because if you are a customer that has dedicated your focus to Microsoft and you're using the OpenAI service for Azure, you're using Power Platform, you're using a lot of the other elements, and knowing that this is a solution that's going to come in and integrate well with the other things you're doing in a Microsoft-based environment, that obviously gives you some confidence about the extensibility and the integration of that solution versus
Right.
something where they haven't really thought through that.
Yeah, that's so true, Mike. I mean, we think about, and this is what the Pegasus program is all about. So we bring in these high potential startups. We do technically vet them. We make sure that they're using the best that Microsoft has to offer and constantly evolving as the AI world evolves. And then when we do go to customers, we are able to say, look, Mr. or Mrs. CIO, CTO, this is a Microsoft vetted startup. We've validated their architecture. It fits with your architectural patterns and standards, and hopefully that eases things for everybody on both sides.
Yeah, I'm sure it gives them confidence, and certainly having the support of Microsoft alongside that startup, that's an important indication, because I think a lot of the executives, again, are trying to figure out, is this a partner that will be around in a couple of years?
Hmm.
Or where might this go? So thinking a little bit more about that, when you're thinking for the healthcare executives, what are some of those signals that this is a company that has some staying power and is going to be around and kind of be a scale, or it will help them achieve scale at some point? What are some of the indications we haven't hit yet?
So I think there are a few that are worthwhile. I would look at their funding profile. I would look at if it's a serial founder. I mean, there's something to be said. Even if they did not have a successful exit, being a serial founder is a different animal than someone starting out on their first one. The other thing, we talked about the team and making sure there is a team behind this. And of course, getting references, frankly, from their funders, from us. I mean, I've been on reference calls. All of that goes a long way to confirming that this is a real deal. Now, on the technology side, like you said, things change daily. We do our best to try and make sure that all of these organizations are up to date. But knowing and perhaps getting a view into the product development roadmap of that startup to understand what they're thinking is also going to be very comforting, I think, for an enterprise customer. I mean, if you go, so what's next on your product development roadmap? And they go, well, we don't know. It's not a good sign.
Or worse, what would you like to see?
Yeah.
Like
Well,
certainly you want
it's like,
some customer input, but then,
yeah,
if they're putting too much pressure on the customer to kind of plan the roadmap for the company, that's a lot, right?
right. It should be, here's our product development roadmap. We'd love your input. That's the answer
Right.
you want, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think having the collaboration, but yeah, that they have some sort of a game plan of where they're going, and oftentimes it is tied. From talking to them just as much as I do, it's often tied to the next funding round, right? So, like, if we get the next round of funding, or when we get it, here is what we plan to do. The interesting trend also that we see is many healthcare systems and payers through various methods are investing in these health tech companies, right? They're putting their money into these rounds and then literally buying in for part of the ownership of the company and the roadmap, right, to see where it goes. And I think there's some really interesting collaboration we see in those environments too.
Absolutely, and we've got a few of those that are working quite well.
Yeah, that's great. So when you think about the year ahead, we're recording this at the end of 2025. We'll debut in the early 2026 timeframe. But when you think about the year ahead and kind of the work that you're doing with partners, what advice do you have for customers who are looking at some of these startups and some of the opportunities that exist with them?
Contact me. I can help. That's number one. Um, no, I think the right amount of due diligence is probably key. Making sure that you are investing in an area that's key for your organization. I mean, there are a lot of science projects and a lot of, and we've all heard this before, like, technology for technology's sake. We're so past that. And in healthcare specifically, less so in life sciences, we have so many providers that are running on low margins that making sure that it's a revenue generator or a cost cutter is going to be key both for the enterprise purchaser and the startup because they want to be in an area that's truly going to help you. So, mapping that out and understanding what the likely outcome is going to be, documenting it, and then sharing it internally with the enterprise gives them not only the professional visibility personally, but the professional visibility to scale and be known as an innovator. Which, look, we all want to do what's best for our organization, but hopefully it's best for ourselves as well as we build our career journeys. So I think all of those things lend itself to being at the forefront of innovation in a productive way.
Yeah, that's great advice, Sally. And I know you joked about contacting you, but you have, this is how I got to know you. You are a tireless advocate for your partners that participate in your program. And I
Thank
think
you.
that's admirable work that you're doing. So you can connect with Sally, reach out through LinkedIn, is probably a good channel for
Yeah.
doing that. You can also pick up the Startup Protocol and the Unicorn Protocol, both available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. And we certainly appreciate your feedback and your suggestions on what customers can focus on and how they partner with health tech companies. So thanks for sharing your expertise today, Sally.
Thank you, Mike, for the opportunity. It was great to talk to you, and hopefully this has helped a few people along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for listening to the Health Tech Edge. If you found this helpful, share it with someone who'd get value from it. And if you want more conversations on how tech is reshaping healthcare operations, follow the show and stay connected with us. We will see you next time.